Okay, welcome Biology 158 to Chapter 26 on the urinary system. This is our third to last chapter for the summer course. So we're going to cover all about the kidneys, the ureters, and the bladder for this unit. So to start out, like always, we're going to talk about the functions of the urinary system. So ultimately, the urinary system's main function is to basically excrete things from the body, any sort of waste or byproducts that we don't need. So it consists of 4 different structures: the kidneys, the ureters, the actual urinary bladder, and the urethra. A lot of people think just the urinary system is simply responsible for just holding the urine and getting rid of it. But really the main attraction for the urinary system is the kidneys themselves. The kidneys do so many things for the body. The bladder just stores the urine to remove it. The kidneys do most of the work. Starting out, the kidneys are responsible for ultimately excreting all the waste products from the blood into the ureters eventually to make urine, to get rid of them. Your kidney regulates a whole bunch of things, so blood volume and pressure, blood solute concentrations, as well as pH levels. So if anything is getting too high or too low, like blood volume or pressure, concentration, or pH, the kidneys can adjust things accordingly through either sympathetic stimulation from the nervous system or hormonally to adjust. Additionally, the kidneys help with red blood cell synthesis. They release the hormone EPO, which we remember as erythropoietin, that helps with promoting red blood cell creation. And then ultimately helps with the synthesis of vitamin D. Kidneys ultimately are able to convert vitamin D to an active form. That vitamin D is needed to regulate calcium levels in the body. So urinary system, pretty straightforward in terms of how many pieces there are. You just have the 2 kidneys, the ureter coming off of each of them. Both those ureters empty into the urinary bladder, and then the urinary bladder then has the urethra coming off to remove urine. So starting out with the major attraction for the urinary system, that is the kidney. So the kidneys are these 2 bean-shaped organs that are located on the posterior abdominal wall, so towards the back, next to the vertebral column. They are what are called retroperitoneal, meaning that they're behind the peritoneum. That's one of the serous membranes that we talked a lot about during the digestive system unit. The kidneys are located behind that. So, with the external location of the kidneys themselves, we have the vertebral column here, and then the right and left kidney here, ultimately having those ureters extend off down into the bladder and the pelvis. If we do a top-down view with the transverse section, we have your kidneys here and here. There's a couple of structures that are surrounding the kidneys themselves. The first structure is called the renal capsule. That is this brown line that I'm running my mouse over. That's just made of fibrous connective tissue. You then have the renal fascia. That is this sort of green-yellow line I'm running my mouse around. That's just another layer of connective tissue, but it helps to anchor the kidneys on the posterior wall so they don't move around a lot and they stay where they are. You then, of course, have some adipose tissue surrounding that, like most organs. This helps just to sort of cushion the organ from any sort of impacts or blows. And then lastly, you have the hilum. This is the little indentation, which allows for all the blood vessels and the ureters and the nerves to come in and out of the kidney. You have a hilum for each kidney on the right and left. Then looking at the kidneys themselves for the internal anatomy, a lot of different structures to look at here. First, the general regions of the kidney. You have the cortex and the medulla. The cortex is the outermost region of the kidney. When I'm running my mouse along, all of this is considered the cortex. So all the outer region of the kidney is the cortex. Then you have the inner region, which is known as the medulla. That's the inner region. So everything I'm running my mouse over here is the medulla, that inner portion of the kidney. Within the medulla, you have what are called renal pyramids. That's this yellow structure with holes I'm running my mouse over right now. Ultimately, when blood is filtered and urine is formed, that urine is going to move to this renal papilla which points towards the sinus, which contains all the blood vessels and renal pelvis and everything. After the urine goes through that renal pyramid, it's going to hit the calyces. You have the minor calyces and the major calyces. Minor calyces are just located in front of all the renal pyramids. You have a bunch of them. So all those minor calyces eventually converge to form major calyces. So for example, this is a minor calyce in front of this renal papilla. This is a minor calyce in front of this renal papilla. When both these combine, they form a major calyce. All of those major calyces are then going to conform to the large structure known as the renal pelvis. That's this yellow area that's underneath the renal artery and renal vein I'm circling. Eventually, the renal pelvis is going to exit that kidney and form the ureters, which are going to move the urine to the bladder. Then zooming in more, we're now on the actual structural unit of the kidney, and that is the nephron. So the nephron has 4 different pieces. You have the renal corpuscle. That's the very first structure right here. This is ultimately for filtering the blood. Then you have 3 other structures which are responsible for secretion and reabsorbing things. First one is the proximal convoluted tubule that comes right after the renal corpuscle. Then have the loop of Henle after we get past the proximal tubule. So this giant loop here is the loop of Henle. After we get through the loop of Henle, we then have the distal convoluted tubule, and that eventually empties into this giant structure right here, which is the collecting duct. The collecting duct ultimately will lead to the renal papilla, which is this structure right here I talked about a minute ago. So that renal papilla will then lead to the minor calyces, then the major calyces, then the renal pyramids to the ureter. So just so you know how everything connects. With the nephrons, you have 2 types of nephrons. You have juxtamedullary nephrons and you have cortical nephrons. So juxtamedullary nephrons, juxta means next to, and then medullary, I think, medulla for the kidney region. So this is the medulla region, this is the cortex. So cortex being outer, medulla being inner. For your juxtamedullary nephrons, our renal corpuscle is going to be a lot closer to this border between the cortex and the medulla. And this loop of Henle is going to dive way deeper into the medulla than our cortical nephrons. For our cortical nephrons, the name, you have cortex in the name, so that helps remember it. The renal corpuscle is way higher than the cortex themselves. And then the loop of Henle extends nowhere near as deep as the juxtamedullary nephron. So functionally, the juxtamedullary nephron, is a much larger loop of Henle. This ultimately helps reabsorb a lot more water when needed over the cortical nephron. So then getting into the actual structures specifically that make up the nephron, we're going to go through them one by one. The first is called the renal corpuscle. This is the filtration site for the blood in the nephron. The renal corpuscle is made up of 2 smaller structures. The first one's called the Bowman capsule. This is basically a 2-walled chamber that collects the filtrate after it's gone through the other structure, which is the glomerulus. The Bowman capsule has an outer portion, which is the parietal layer, and then an inner portion, which is called the visceral layer. And that visceral layer has special cells that are called podocytes. Those podocytes help make a filtration membrane that filter the blood. And then the second portion of the renal corpuscle is the glomerulus. This is just the actual capillaries that go into the Bowman's capsule. So all this capillary mesh that I'm circling is the glomerulus. It's providing the blood for the kidney. So zooming in, with our Bowman capsule, we can have that parietal layer. So the outer section of the capsule, that's made of your simple squamous epithelium, just lining everything. Then you have your visceral layer, which is this inner layer with those special cells called the podocytes. And they just wrap all around the glomerular capillaries. So they sit right on top of them. So zooming in again, on top of our glomerular capillaries This slide is showing you the actual podocytes within the visceral layer of the Bowman capsule. So the podocytes have your cell body with the nucleus and everything, and these giant cell processes that are extending off of the cell body all over the glomerular capillaries. On top of this, on top of the processes, you have what are called filtration slits. These are these little wavy gaps that you see all along the processes. This makes up part of your filtration membrane within the renal corpuscle. Then you have another structure that's within the actual capillaries themselves called fenestrae. These are just these little gaps that I'm running my mouse over right now. So all these gaps help make up another portion of the filtration membrane. Ultimately, you have the fenestrae and the filtration slits combined to make that filtration membrane to ultimately filter the blood. So that filtration membrane is made up of your capillary endothelium, which is this white portion I'm running my mouse over. And we have those gaps between the endothelium. That's the fenestrae. Then you have a basement membrane, which is a yellow line I'm running my mouse over. And then you actually have the podocyte cell processes, which are these purple mounds that I'm running my mouse over now. And then any sort of slits that are between them from the spaces in the cell processes. So collectively, these three things make up that filtration membrane. And when blood is moves through the capillaries, it's going to move across this filtration membrane, and depending on what's being filtered out or not filtered out, it's going to move into the Bowman capsule. So then we have your arterioles and the juxtaglomerular apparatus within the Bowman capsule. So these terms you've seen before, afferent and efferent. The afferent arteriole comes in, brings the blood into the glomerular capillary area, and then the efferent arteriole moves blood out of the glomerular capillary. So you've seen the terms afferent and efferent when we talked about the lymph nodes, with the vessels having afferent vessels and efferent vessels. Same exact idea. Then you have what's called the juxtaglomerular apparatus, and this is made of two components, so the juxtaglomerular cells and the macula densa. So the actual juxtaglomerular cells is all these cells made of smooth muscle going around the afferent arteriole. And then the macula densa are these special tubule cells right next to it that make up part of the distal tubule. And we'll talk about the distal tubule in a moment. But collectively, they make up this apparatus, and this apparatus's main function is to produce renin. And if you remember when we talked about blood, there is the renin angiotensin aldosterone mechanism, where renin is released and it converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, which then goes on to ultimately produce aldosterone, which helps with reabsorption of water. So very important for kicking off that mechanism. Okay, so that was the renal corpuscle. All of that was just that one structure. Then we have what's called the renal tubule, which contains the other sections of the nephron and then the collecting tubules. So after we leave and have the blood filtered in the actual renal corpuscle, it moves to the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal convoluted tubule is where you have a lot of reabsorption of water as well as secretion of other substances we need to get into the urine. After we move through that convoluted tubule, we get to the giant loop, which is the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle has a descending limb, so the limb that's going down. That's where a lot of the water diffuses out. It's very permeable to water. And then you have an ascending limb. You got a thin section of the limb and a thick section of the limb. This section of the loop of Henle is very permeable to ions. So ions are able to move in or out depending on what's needed. However, it's not very permeable to water. So we don't have a lot of water reabsorption on the ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Once we get through the loop of Henle, we then reach the distal convoluted tubule. This is where we have a lot of reabsorption of your key ions, so things like your sodium, your potassium, and your chloride. And then once the filtrate, which is just the name of the fluid that's moving through the nephron, reaches the collecting duct, those collecting ducts again go on to the renal papilla, which then go to the minor calyces, the major calyces, the renal pelvis, then to the ureter and the bladder.